Hey guys, this is Eric Weingarten with Weingarten Racing. Today's video is a brilliant tech video, and it's something different. And I'm not saying that people don't already know this. I hate when YouTube things do that. Like, I'm gonna tell you something no one's ever told you before. No, it's not like that. Several of you probably know this, some may not. But I found something during dyno testing. I want to share it with you because it was unusual. And that thing might answer the question that's been asked in several of the dyno sessions that I have asked of myself. Why in the hell is this manifold so good? So this is the Edelbrock Victor Jr. 2975. It's an old version. And if you go back and you watch some of my previous videos about my small block Chevy dyno testing, this manifold for a 4150 has been one of the best ones tested. There's only been like one other one that's beat it, and it was heavily ported. So this one, and it's just had the blending here that I added, which didn't do nothing, has been phenomenal. And it does have a port match that some of the manifolds don't have, which you're like, well, there it is. Today I could say yes and no. It's not what you're thinking. So when I was looking at this manifold, I'd actually looked at everything I could think of. So I've measured the runner length, how long each one was, the taper, in other words, the opening versus the exit, and the flow difference. There was a bunch of different things, and I'd actually lined it out with all the other manifolds that were tested on the small block Chevy Dyno Mule. So I think to date we've tested like 16 manifolds, trying to figure out what makes this one so special. Matter of fact, if you go back and watch the previous video, I have a new version of the 2975 that, it's not a newer version, but it's a brand new one. And it was down 20 horsepower from this one. Now, it wasn't port matched, but it was down 20. And it didn't make any sense because it looked like it was had more radiuses, less casting flaws. This thing should look like it made more power, but this one still made more power. So it's been an ongoing issue, like thinking of like, why, right? By accident, in the testing on this it's actually like its sixth dyno session, third set of heads, I think we now have an answer. And it's the answer came from testing a different manifold, not that one. Although that one was tested, that kind of verified it. So bear with me as I explain this story because it'll make way more sense. Since I know some of you are going to ask, well, what is this dyno you're talking about? Maybe you're new to my channel. It's a 406 small block Chevy. It's got a Dart SHP block. Scat rotating assembly, it's 11.2 compression ratio. It's an Urson solid roller cam, 260, 270, and 685 lift, 108 LSA. In the process of this entire dyno mule testing, it has 3 different sets of cylinder heads have now been on it. It's had an AFR Enforcer 195 head on it. Then it had the ProMax Project X 215s. And currently, and what I'm talking about in this video, it has a set of ProMax 235 CNC ported heads. They are my port design. So I ported it, sent it to ProMax, and they had it digitized, and that's my actual port design. So I'm the designer of that port. So, and that was tested on this session, and in that session, the answer, I think I've got it now. So, anyway, to kind of give you a little bit of backstory about the head itself, because this part plays an important part to it. Whenever a head gets digitized and copied, we usually make the chamber larger because this way there's no shadow. So for instance, whenever the CNC machine cleans up, we don't want shadows because people, for whatever reason, think that the head isn't as good as they see any gas cast finish. And you're like, what are you talking about? Well, this is a Brodix Dragonslayer head. Now it's CNC gasket matched, but if people ever see, like, pretend this is all full CNC ported, if they ever see just a spot like this where there's some as cast finish, they freak out. So due to that, the chambers themselves were made kind of large. The chambers ended up at 70 cc's when it came off the machine. So because I'm doing the dyno mule testing, I want them all to be the same compression ratio. So the 215 stock heads, ProMax 215s, had 64 cc chambers. The 235s after they got out of the machine were 70 cc's. So they had to be milled to get to the same compression ratio. And it takes about 6 thousandths of milling. So you mill off 6 thousandths flat mill, and you remove 1 cc. So if you do the math, we had to remove 36 thousandths. So that's cutting flat mill. That means you're cutting exactly flat all the way across with 36 thousandths. What that does, and this plays the important part for today's video, is it reduces this distance. So this distance from the bottom of the port to here gets reduced. But the biggest thing is this port itself, because you cut off 36 thousandths, essentially what you're doing is you're moving this port down 36 thousandths. Doesn't sound like a big deal. 36 thousandths isn't that big, right? It got the compression ratio obviously the same, but it did shift the ports down. Is it the end of the world? No, but it did help me to find something. So the very first manifold that I usually test whenever I'm switching heads is the TrickFlow R manifold. You might say, why in the world did you pick that one? Because of all the manifolds so far that I've tested, and there's been like 16 were tested with the AFR Enforcers, probably like 13 or so with the stock ProMatch Project X 215s. Of all the manifolds that were tested, only one has remained exactly as it was when I bought it, and that's been the TrickFlow R intake. So that one I have not modified in any way. This one, for instance, this Victor Jr. here, I blended these dividers thinking I would gain some more power, only worth 2. So because it's been modified, I didn't want to use that. So I want to use a TrickFlow R because it's exactly the same that's been on all the other heads. In fairness, the TrickFlow R intake, and I know this is probably not fairness, but in honesty, the TrickFlow R intake has been an absolute piece of crap. It's been a turd. It finished almost near the end, the lowest one on the AFR Enforcers. When the 215s went on, it was also a dog with near the bottom. It has not been a good manifold. It does not seem to make the power of the other manifolds that have been tested. So I bolted on here to this set of heads. And I should also point out the TrickFlow R manifold, since it's not touched at all, it's port exit. So let's pretend that this is actually the manifold. So like we'll pretend we're looking at the manifold on. This does better for demonstration. When you look at the TrickFlow R intake, if I put the 1206 gasket, which happens to be this one, if I put it up to the TrickFlow R intake, it's actually really close to this size. The only catch is it's got more corner radius. And so it's really close to this size. Now, why does that matter? Well, here's why. When I was doing the AFR Enforcer heads, the TrickFlow was actually bigger because that opening was bigger. When I moved to the Project X 215 heads, I thought for sure now we're going to see some benefits from the TrickFlow R intake because its opening was almost the same size as the stock Project X 215s. It didn't do very well. And then when I went to these 235s, the ports are even bigger because I CNC ported them, so they're a little bit larger. This should be even better fit. However, when I went to bolt it on, this is what I saw. And before I show you the picture, I want you to see what I'm trying to talk about. What I have done is got the heads bolted to the engine. I have a gasket in here, and you're going to see this blue that you have from Felpro. What you're doing is I'm taking a picture down inside the intake manifold so that you could see what I'm seeing, and you'll see a little bit of this blue showing. So here's what I mean. Now, on all the times I have tested before, that same thing has happened. And what has happened is, pretend this is the manifold again. Now I'm going to do some exaggeration here. Essentially, the manifold's sitting like this. So we have our head port openings here, but the manifold's sitting like so. So even though it's port matched, so you could think of the intake manifold is port matched, but it's not port matched in the right location. That's what kind of gets you. So people are like, oh, it was a port match that made it great. No. Turns out what I think it is the port match location. It's not that it's not ported the exact size, it's right size, wrong spot, too high. And so when I'm looking down in there, you're thinking, well, it's not going to seal. No, there's still plenty of material. So we actually did a dyno test exactly with what you saw. And the results are this, which you've also seen in the previous video. This is the TrickFlow R intake used on both. The black line was with the stock 215 heads. The red lines were the 235 CNC ported heads. It gained 15 horsepower and 12 foot-pounds of torque. I was like, okay. Well, because I was at Dunsmouth Machine Shop in Enid, and he's got a full access, he has his full machine shop, I said, you know what? We haven't done this, but we should do this. Why don't, while we're testing, because I never test just one manifold and call it done. No. We're going to be switching a bunch of different manifolds to try other ones, especially that one. So I said, hey, since we got time testing, can you have one of your guys surface or mill off the intake manifold so that it sits correctly. So in other words, how do you fix this situation when the manifold's sitting high like this? Well, you can't put in a thinner gasket. You need something to make the intake manifold sit lower or get down. You could remove it. I'd have to remove the whole gasket to get it sit close to what it would be. That's not practical. We have to run a gasket. So what you can do is what I had him do. As I said, take 60 thousandths off this flange here, and then of course you take 60 thousandths off the other side. What that will do is it makes the manifold sit in the V-wedge lower, so it lowers its height down. You also have to take 100 thousandths off the China rail side, otherwise what will happen is you'll put it on and this hits, and it won't go down further because it's hitting on the block. So what essentially what that will do is it will cause it to get now in the same alignment like this. It will reduce it. So in the meantime, I went back to testing this manifold. Now, if you remember, like I said before, this thing has been amazing. It's been the best 4150 of all of them. The Trick Flow R had been the worst, almost. Not the worst, but pretty bad. Now, this one had been port matched, and it had been port matched to a 1206, which, by the way, its openings and stuff are not that far different from the Trick Flow R. This just has less corner radius. But this is the first time, because the heads had been milled, where the location wasn't ideal. So again, it was doing this similar to what the Trick Flow R had, just not as bad. So it was raised up, but it was not raised up where you could see the blue in the gasket. Like when I put on the manifold, I didn't see the blue in the gasket. I didn't see that at all. But it was raised up, but I could see, I couldn't see the bottom of the runner. Usually you could see right here where it slopes right down the bottom. Instead, the manifold was just a tad higher. For the first time ever, it wasn't sitting exactly flush with where the head is to line up exactly right. So 1206 was the same, but it was now a little bit higher than what it had been before. And that might explain this. So this is the Victor Jr., same type of situation. Black line's a stock 215, the red line's a 235s. The Victor Jr. only gained the CNC ported heads with the Victor Jr. only gained 5 horsepower, no foot-pounds of torque. It makes no sense because look at this. The Trick Flow R, which I just showed you, the only thing that we went from non-CNC ported heads to the CNC ported heads, it gained 15. But with the Victor Jr., it only gained 5. Why did this one gain so much more? So it was like very, very odd. But as we're testing the rest of the manifolds, he's milling down to get it to fit right. And here's what happens. So hopefully I didn't mess this up. I'm showing you. Here. This is the difference. Now this is a weird one, so bear with me. We have the red line is the Trick Flow R that's been milled down. So this is after milling. The black line was exactly stock. Look at this. Now at the lower RPMs, it looked like it lost some. Now this might be because of that step, that weird step. It actually is moving, the air velocities are higher. But once you're onto it, it gained. That gained right there. That was 9 horsepower, 3 foot-pounds of torque. 9 horsepower, 3 foot-pounds of torque. Why do I say that? Because look at what from doing the CNC ported heads to the non-CNC ported heads, it was only worth 5 horsepower and 0 foot-pounds of torque. Getting the port alignment right on the manifold, 9 horsepower, 3 foot-pounds of torque. All from getting, and this is no grinding, this is simply milling. No port work, whatever. Getting it to line up correctly, moving it down so it sits, the port match now sits not high, but where it should be, 9 horsepower. Now, if I look at the heads, we get to this. This was the stock 215 heads. This is the 235. Now they have this, the port alignment's the same. 22 horsepower gain and 15 foot-pounds of torque total from the difference between the heads. Because on the 215s, that's the black line, when the Trick Flow R was on it, because the 215s had not been milled, they were already 64 cc's, it was already sitting about what this milling made it sit. So by having the intake manifold aligned properly to this opening, that was where the power came from. That's why I think this whole time the Victor Jr. has been doing so good, this old one. It had little to do with anything else, the runner designs, anything else, because they were, like I said, they were so close to other ones. It was where the port match location was compared to the head. It just happened to be right for this one because of how much might have been milled off this side or whatever to get it to sit correctly. Once fitting that to it made the difference. How much difference? Let me put it this way. I just told you at the beginning of this video that Trick-Flow R was a dog. Of all the manifolds, and it's supposed to be the top knot. I know Old Man's Garage puts them on this stuff. I thought it would be a winner. And by the way, they didn't give me the manifold. I bought that outright. It was a piece of crap. One of the worst. The milling, after it got milled, moved it from almost last to now it's the best 4150 manifold. And here's what I'm getting at. That was been the #1 manifold used on all the cylinder heads up until milling of the Trick-Flow R. Once the Trick-Flow R got milled and moved to this location, it then had made more power than that thing. For the first time ever, something beat that with a 4150 flange. Ever. Getting the alignment correct. So what was today's tech video is? It's not so much the port match. Yes, that's important. Because a lot of people are like, I port match my intake, it's fine. Did you check to see if the port match location lined up with your heads though? I have mock-up blocks that I sit over here. I mean, here, look at this. That's the mock-up block for the small block Chevy 10-2 deck, one for a big block Chevy 9/8 over there. Here's the Ford 351. There's a 302 back in the corner. I have mock-up blocks I use. So when I get the alignment correctly, I'll put the heads on and do all this. That's why this guy's got his gaskets here, sitting here, that the alignment gets correct. That is more important than just port matching. So if you just like, well, I port match my manifold, I gain the power. You better check to make sure it actually lined up correctly. So you're like, well, how do you fix that? Slim. Well, there's two ways. If it's sitting low like this, it's actually an easier fix. They sell thicker gaskets. This is a 60 thousandths gasket. They sell ones that are like 120. If you get a thicker gasket, it raises up the manifold. If it's too high, like what this one was, you got to cut material off the manifold, which means you got to send it to a machine shop. I have a fixture I use to cut them off, and that will lower it down. But that is the tech tip for you today. The thing that was discovered, port match location. Because I thought it wouldn't make, I knew it made some power, but I didn't think 9 horsepower and 3 foot-pounds of torque. No way. I didn't think it would make the worst manifold we had tested so far. Well, not the worst. One of the worst manifolds become the best manifold tested so far, but it did. And I think I've got, oh, I don't have it. Let me show you real quick. This is what last thing I want to show you. On all the manifolds, I also tried testing with the Dominator. And so what I have here is the 3 best manifolds that's been tested with the Dominator. So just give you an idea. We'll start with the blue line. This is a 2892 manifold, Zellenbrock Victor 2, but I've heavily ported it. And I actually converted it to a Dominator. So I welded the flange, moved the bolt locations. And this thing's a bad boy. As you can tell, it's a blue line. It's above all the rest, right? This next one's an Edelbrock 2970. It's the Super Victor, but it's a Dominator 1. The clover release has been removed. It's the black line. So it's pretty good. And now, this was unusual. This is the Trick-Flow R. It's a 4150 manifold, but I use an adapter, the HVH 4150 to 4500 adapter with a tapered deal with the Dominator on it. And it's below the others, except for at the peaks, it's really, really close. That never would have happened without the milling. So it made the worst manifold start really competing with, one of the worst manifolds start competing with the better manifolds. Port match. Yeah, I know, crazy, right? So anyway, that's the point for today's video. Hopefully you guys got something out of it. If you look at these graphs and you're like, man, I don't know what just happened with the camera. You're like, man, that looks really cool. I wish I could, I wish I had a book of this. Well, I sell the books of these. This is still available for pre-order, and I think I'm going to cut it off at the end of the week. So at the end of the week, the pre-orders are over, and I'm only going to order like 10 more extra than what I have for pre-orders. So you can go to my, how do you order them? It's simple. You go to my website, wengines.com. There's a link on the homepage to my online stores through BraveNet. And then you can look, and it has no cover on it. It'll be like new book, whatever. It costs $65. You're like, yeah, it's expensive. Yep. And there's $10 shipping too on it. But it will have this information and also have all the dyno. Not just this. It'll have all the dynos tests from the last test session, which was test session 6. But it was also going to have the final session with the 496 on there as well. And you can purchase those. You also sign up. By the way, if you buy that book, you become a channel member. And so what that does is when I go back to dyno testing in January, as I'm doing it, I'm going to text you results so you already know. So channel members knew all this stuff the day of. I actually did little video clips and sent it to them. So like, this is exciting. I can't believe I found this. I was more excited about discovering that than I was about how the heads did, so that was interesting. So buy the books. It helps with the dyno stuff too. There's other stuff on the store as well. Now, there's one more video I'm going to do about this, because after getting off the dyno, I always learn something besides this, and I found some stuff with the cylinder heads that are coming up. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to do to the cylinder heads now because of what I saw on the dyno. And that will be the next video, probably Monday. And then the final one I'm going to do probably for this year is I'm going to do a whole wrap-up video of all the dyno sessions that have been done in one gigantic video. Because what happens is, a lot of people kept saying, wait a minute, I thought this isn't the best one. You said the Hurricane was the best one. It was at that dyno session, but as later dyno sessions went on and more things got tested, the Victor Jr. ended up being the best. So to help clarify things, I'm going to compile all the results. I'm going to make one gigantic video of all the dyno testing that was done this year so you can actually see what I'm talking about. I can show the results for everything that's happened, and we'll go through them, in depth, or not really in depth, but we'll go through them in one complete video to wrap it all together. So you can just watch one video instead of like 20 others to figure out what happened. That'll be at the end of the year. Anyway, guys, I appreciate you sticking around and watching this. Remember, I'm no Superman. I don't port cast iron. I don't know anybody that ports cast iron. And you guys take care.